I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dr. Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, back from last week, and also your other doctor, Dean Detloff.
I don't know why, but lately I'm just feeling like I really need to lean into being a doctor. I think I've tried to hide it. I've tried to put it under a bushel, but these days I need to let everyone know. Listen, I can't write any prescriptions, but I can tell you to go read Heidegger. I wouldn't tell you that though. Don't worry, I would never say that to you.
That's a bad prescription.
That's the one that makes you more sick.
One of my favorite, the podcast is already off the rails, but it's fine. One of my favorite Heidegger things. This podcast is not about Heidegger, but Walter Benjamin, the great German Marxist that everybody knows and loves, he famously hated Heidegger without ever having read him, which I think is amazing. And and Bertolt Brecht, there's a story where they were going to create a reading group with the sole purpose of, I read this in a biography. The purpose was the destruction of Martin Heidegger. That was the reading group. And I thought that was extremely funny. Yeah, they did not get around to it, sadly. But man, what a thing that would have been to read.
Yeah, for real. I would have signed up for that in a minute. That's amazing. All right, we got a lot of stuff to get into in this episode, but I think I want to take the first 3 minutes, and only 3 minutes, to talk about the new issue of G's magazine. I'm so sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I just feel like this is not what people are coming here for, but this is what you're going to get, whether you like it or not.
That's what people are coming here for, that energy.
That's right. And we should lean into that more. I'm a doctor after all, and this is what I am prescribing you.
Sometimes you don't know the pills that you need to take. That's why you go to the doctor.
That's right. We were talking about G's a few weeks ago and how great it is, and they came out with another banger, and I'm really excited about it. I have a really short essay in there about the Zapatista Air Force of paper airplanes, which is great. And Dean has an incredible interview in there with Margaret Randall, who we've had on the show before, and I really want everyone to go read it. It's very cool. Also, man, there is some other really cool things in here too that I don't think I would have ever considered as a person ever in my life. So the issue is about crafting, which is a cool idea, but there's a lot of really good pieces in there about the ways that, crafting is a really sort of like intimate thing, and the ways that we kind of interpret it can be really interesting. There's a piece in there from Julia DeBoer, who is a person who I've met in real life, which is great, about knitting, and I love it. It's great. So much good stuff in this magazine. Dean, what do you think about it? You were kind of involved in the production, so maybe you're biased, but what do you think?
I was also going to mention the Julia piece, actually, also just because I know her, I guess. So it was really fun, because I didn't know that she had even submitted, so it was a surprise to me to read what she had to write. That was really cool. It's a great piece about knitting and body positivity and like what it's like to make your own clothes and how cool that is. So extremely neat. Lots of cool stuff. Eventually, we should just have Lydia and Kateri or somebody on to talk about it soon. Maybe we will, but it is really fun. I could tell a cool story about this Margaret Randall interview. So Margaret Randall, for people who don't know, she's an amazing woman. She grew up in the U.S. She moved to Mexico. Then she moved to Cuba. And long story short, she ended up in Nicaragua at the invitation of Ernesto Cardenal, because she was a poet and he was a poet. And she worked in the Ministry of Culture in the Sandinista government for a while and has all kinds of wild stories, which she shared on this podcast in the past. So you should go listen to that. Anyway, the reason that she is in this issue is Lydia, the editor at G's, sent out this reminder that we had deadlines coming up, and I had not thought about my section at all. Confession time, I guess. And I was like panicking for a minute, being like, oh my gosh, who am I going to interview? It's about crafting. I don't do a lot of crafting, so I don't even know what to do. And I was emailing Margaret Randall about something else completely, and I was like, hey, you know a thing or two about crafting, don't you? A person who has written poetry and worked with Ernesto Cardenal, and she was totally down to do it really quickly, and it was great. I'm really proud of how the interview turned out. It was one of those great Holy Spirit connections, I guess, in the end. And also, she contributed a poem to the issue, which is really neat, too. It's a great poem, so lots of cool stuff in there. Also, a really good issue if you want to understand how important it is that G's is a print magazine. It just looks beautiful. Lots of really cool opportunities to highlight people's craft and what craft is and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you should get it. You should subscribe to G's. This is a great issue to give to your mom. 10 out of 10 crafting issue.
Yeah, for sure. It's $14, and there's no better way you could spend $14, I think. This is it.
I agree.
Great. Okay, let's talk about something a little bit more grim. G's is a great a font of life and joy and intrigue. But let me tell you about something that sucks. It's called capitalism, Dean. So, listen, if you have participated in any Verso or Haymarket book sale in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, you'll know all about capitalism. You've got finance capitalism. You've got cognitive capitalism. There's fossil capitalism and cannibal capitalism. There's disaster capitalism. Are there any, Dean, are there any other capitalisms I'm missing? I mean, I'm sure there's probably a lot, right?
Oh yeah, there's extractive capitalism. There's also all kinds of scenes right now. The capitalist scene, the Cthulhu scene, that all have something to do with capitalism. It's a growing pile of terms for sure.
People love it. People love naming their book something capitalism. They can't. Audiences can't get enough of it, and authors can't stop writing it.
Okay, wait. If you had to name a capitalism, what would yours be, Matt?
Oh no, you can't put me on the spot like that.
I just did it, so it looks like I can. Doctor to doctor.
No, I would never do that. I would never write a book called something capitalism. I would let somebody else do it for sure.
Mine would be Satan capitalism.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That's good. Satanic capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. I like that a lot. Nope, still not going to do it. I'm not going to participate in this one.
Yeah, okay.
That's your choice. I'm the doctor, and I'm the doctor, and I'm saying that this is too much. I need less. All right, but let's talk about this though. There's all these types of capitalism floating around out there, but let's talk about one that maybe you haven't heard of, or if you have, then that's cool for you. But maybe some people haven't. We're going to talk about one that's not been in a recent Verso book sale, and that's monopoly capitalism. That's right, folks. This week we are starting up a new and probably short-lived series on Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, two Pauls, book about monopoly capital, which came out in 1966. So it definitely ahead of the curve on naming books in this way. You might recognize Baran and Sweezy as the guys of Monthly Review. I'm just kidding. You definitely don't recognize them at all, right? These are two guys you've never heard of. These two guys named Paul. Yeah, there's no way you've heard of them. I mean, if you have, you're definitely cool. You get it. You get more cool points than the rest of us. But like, no one's heard of them. But they are founders of the Monthly Review, which is our second favorite magazine behind G's. That's the hierarchy. G's is number 1. Monthly Review is number 2.
And those are the only two you need.
That's right. But beyond Monthly Review, they're also really well known for their, what's groundbreaking work, I think, about the ins and outs of monopoly capitalism. I think it's a pretty big deal, actually, this book. I think if you read stuff about political economy, you definitely run into their names and some of these ideas. But this is a book that I've not read until very recently. It's a pretty big and chunky book, and we're going to split it up a bit. So in this episode, we're going to walk through like the first half-ish of the book. And then next week, we're going to talk about some of like the later half, but we're also going to kind of make some connections that go beyond the book itself. I don't know. Dean, what else do we need to say about Monopoly Capital before we get into it?
Sure. Maybe we can set up the book and the authors a little bit. So Paul Baran, interesting guy. He came from Eastern Europe. I forget where. Somewhere in the Soviet Union. He did all this work in the United States. Paul Sweezy, an interesting guy, also in the U.S. And the two of them did all this pretty original work in a Marxist tradition, but also in a kind of unique Marxist tradition, which we'll talk more about on this podcast. If you look at the monthly review today, if you got your great issue of the month, in the mailbox, you'll see that the tagline is something like, it's like an independent socialist magazine or something like that. And that comes through for sure. They were really interested in development economics and kind of global systems. And they made original contributions to sort of like how we understand imperialism, how we understand how capitalism in the United States in particular kind of has its hands all over the rest of the world, which is pretty unique. And so you're getting a sort of, I think, one of the most powerful economic analyses from within the United States about the United States. And just to maybe add some street cred to that, this book, Monopoly Capital, is dedicated to Che Guevara. And Che, in particular, was a reader of Paul Baran, specifically. And Sweezy and this other guy, Leo Huberman, another monthly review person, they went to Cuba shortly after the revolution and toured around. So, like, they're people who are actively involved in struggles, political struggles. And even though they're academics, even though this book is an extremely hard economics book, it's also a book that, like, people who are actually doing stuff in the world, like Che Guevara, are reading and thinking about and paying attention to. So I think that it maybe is just one kind of good way to contextualize what they're up to, right? There are people in the U.S. thinking about the economic realities of the U.S., but in touch with how that impinges on people all across the world.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So we'll get into the specifics of like what monopoly capitalism is in just 1 minute. But before that, I think it's actually worth contextualizing, I think, why we're going to talk about this book at all. Capitalism is a system that mercilessly exploits not just people in our own country, but people like all the way up and down the supply chain. That is true and should not be a surprise to you if you listen to this podcast. But I think also because we're Christians, it's definitely worth figuring this kind of thing out so that we can, I don't know, better love people and maybe fight back against the ways that capitalism exploits all of these people. I think that, like, you know, Christians in general, they leave things up to, things are too vague. When we start reading the Bible, we hear about all these kinds of people that we should care about and that we should consider directly. And I think it would do everyone a whole lot of good if we figured out, you know, who it is these people that we are supposed to be loving are, and then we figure out who is hurting them, and then we find ways to like sort of like thwart that, right? So I think in this episode we're going to talk about a lot of like political economy types of jargon, but we're doing it to get a better understanding of the ways that capital hurts people, and maybe arrive at some kind of deeper understanding about the ways that I don't know what we can do about it, or like what ways we can push back. Because you definitely can't push back if you don't know how it works.
I was kind of complaining to her about how hard it is to understand economics because I am not an economist. I didn't go to economics school, and I've had to figure all this stuff out on my own. And you never really know if you're getting it quite right. And I was trying to also figure out a problem in this book that I, like, some parts of a problem just were not connecting. So I was explaining it to her and trying to see, like, maybe she could see something I didn't see, or, you know, maybe she could, like, help me think it through and so on. And she was like, why do you want to understand this? Like, what's the point of really, like, figuring it out? And I was like, that's a great question. And I think, like, what I said to her, which I think is true, is the way that you understand a problem really changes the way that you comport yourself or kind of direct yourself toward that problem, right? Like, if you think that capitalism is really, at the end of the day, about a bunch of mean people doing mean stuff, or like stupid people not thinking about stuff, or, you know, these kind of really basic intuitions that maybe we have, but like they kind of stay at that intuitive level, then it becomes really demotivating and really disempowering, or at least it did for me in my own life, to be like, ugh, I hate all these nasty capitalists, you know, like it really bugs me, but there's nothing I can do about it. So it just makes you crabby, or made me crabby. The more you learn about it, the more you're also able to think about what are kind of the nodes of power in that system? Why do certain things happen? you see like a headline from the Wall Street Journal or like the Joe Biden administration or something go by explaining something about the economy, and you can say, well, that's probably not exactly right. And like being able to know why and how to intervene in that conversation. I mean, it's a small consolation prize to be like, I know better. But it's actually a pretty empowering thing to be like, I know better in such a way that I could maybe organize more effectively, or like, relate myself to an international struggle more directly or something like that. So I do think it makes a difference that we take the time to really figure out what monopoly capital is, why it works the way that it does, so that we can figure out how to do something different.
Yeah, I think that's right. You got to know the problem before you can act against it in some way, for sure. All right, well, let's talk about the problem. Let's take a meandering road towards talking about the problem. This book is called Monopoly Capital. It was written in 1966, and I think one way to think about the book, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of like explanation, but I think it's like a counter story to what we know about capitalism and how it works. Here's one way we could start going about it, right? So capitalism is like a big thing, a big network of systems, I guess, that like passes around capital and money, right? We know that to be true. But beyond that, it's also like a story that we tell ourselves about how the world works in particular. So the usual capitalist story goes something like this, right? Through hard work and determination, capitalists grows their business from the ground up. They hire workers, they buy machines, they produce goods, they make profits. And then at the end of the day, they take those profits and then they use them to produce better products more efficiently and pay their workers more and, all these kinds of things. But what encourages capitalists to do all of this is competition with other capitalists, or this is the story, right? This is not the truth. We'll get there in a second. And this competition is good for consumers and it's good for everybody because it pushes capitalists to drive down prices to beat out their competitors, right? So it creates the story of capitalism is one where through competition, capitalists are always kind of getting better because they're always trying to beat out somebody else who's always trying to underline them, right? Since at the end of the day, what really matters is that who has the most customers and who's buying the most, right? Who's creating the most profits. It's the assumption is that like the market will just kind of work itself out to give us the best things that people actually are demanding, right? And there's something to this story historically, maybe. If it was 1860 whatever, maybe some of this would be a little bit true. But what Baran and Sweezy are here to tell us in their book is that it's not true now. It wasn't true in 1966. It is definitely not true now that people are competing in this particular type of way. So in Baran and Sweezy's work, they consider the big corporation as like the primary unit in our current capitalist paradigm, which they pull out against like the robber barons or like the John D. Rockefellers or whatever, right? A big corporation is different than those types of figures. A big corporation acts differently, it produces differently, and it does not compete, which is very different than some of these older types of like businesses and capitalist entities. I don't know, Dean. That's a way to start this conversation off. What do you think?
I think it's good. And also, this is kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, maybe, but worth mentioning now. Baran and Sweezy are intervening in the way that capitalists tell the story about capitalism, right? That capitalism has these competitive kind of relationships, like you were saying, Matt, kind of rises everybody over time. But they're also intervening in a Marxist story about capitalism. Marx had a lot of things to say about the competitive world of capitalism that he was living through in the 1800s. And Baran and Sweezy say Marx got it right. Everything he said about the capitalism that he was living in, it was pretty much true. He had it right on. But capitalism has changed since the 1800s, and it has driven further and further toward a monopoly stage in which major ways that the capitalist economy work have also changed in significant ways. So it's an update also to Marx's theory of capitalism, which is very interesting. And it's cool to actually see Marxists take that seriously. Sometimes you get a criticism of Marxism that it's like, well, Marx couldn't have gotten everything right in the 1800s because, like, we have computers and airplanes and, cars and whatever else now, and so there's no way that he could be right. And at the end of the day, like, it's partly true. There's no way that Marx could have anticipated every single thing that would have happened in the future. But Marx did lay out a certain kind of way of thinking about the economy that allowed Marxists in the future to think through what those changes were, account for them, and do it in a Marxist kind of way. So it's neat to see Baran and Sweezy doing that by tracing what is the big shift from that robber baron era of capitalism to what they call monopoly capital. So it's helpful to kind of have that story too, right? That they're trying to expand on the way that kind of Marx taught us to think about the economy, which is to say, not just repeating whatever Marx said.
Yeah, that's right. It's a disagreement with Marx, or it's a different story. It's an intervention into like the Marxist story, but it's in like a pretty Marxist way, I think.
Yeah.
Something I was thinking of. So the whole first chapter is kind of explaining like what a corporation is, or how big corporations are different than like the previous robber baron age. And I, lots of high-minded distinctions, lots of like academic rigor for sure. But I kept thinking of this this Utah Phillips story, which is far less academic, but I think just as true in some different ways. Utah Phillips is telling this story about how in the old days of being like a traveling IWW guy, it was really easy to know like who the bad guys were in your life, because like you'd be mining in one direction, you'd be like digging into the earth literally while your boss was building like a mansion next door to you or something. And that's such an important distinction that that doesn't hold up, right? It's harder to know who the bosses are, or how they work, or like who is it that your work is really beholden to, or whose profits you're actually making. Not as simple as it used to be, I guess, if Utah Phillips is to be believed, and I do.
Yeah, that's right. Worth mentioning too. So the big corporation for them, you can kind of imagine all kinds of different heavy industries, big corporations in the 60s. But worth mentioning also that the big corporation is typically multinational and global in scope, or kind of globalizing, especially in the 1960s. And even since the time this book was written, there's been a ton more in the tradition of this form of analysis of monopoly capitalism, especially done at the Monthly Review. That's kind of like what put that magazine, I don't know, on the map, or like it's the tradition that it started. And there's a lot of great work kind of continuing to update this too. So it's an ongoing conversation to think through that problem of like, if Utah Phillips thought it was hard to figure out who the bosses are, man, try to figure out like who owns a global multinational company today. You're going to have a hard time.
Yeah, for sure. You're going to have a hard time, but it's probably Nestle though. It's probably who it is. It's probably Nestle. Yeah. It's probably Pepsi. I don't know. One of those. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. GE. I don't know. It's a pretty helpful book too, I think. Sorry, I keep like finding ways to not talk about the next thing, but I think it's a really helpful book because like, I don't know, I'm a person that pays a lot of attention to a handful of fast food corporations. Like that's my job, is to pay attention to them. And this book I think is actually really illustrative of the way that they work. At least I found it to be pretty true. So I don't know. It's definitely a discourse that I'm interested in knowing more about, and I think is actually really helpful if you're going to be like a sort of anti-capitalist person in the world. Okay, so corporations, they're global, they're international corporations. It's your Nestle's, it's your McDonald's, it's your GE's or whatever. But what about the other word, monopoly? That's a pretty important piece, because we've just named 3 or 4 different corporations. You might be thinking, how could there be a monopoly with there being 3 or 4 corporations? So here's a quote from John Bellamy Foster, the current editor of the Monthly Review.
The notorious JBF, as we like to call him.
The notorious JBF. This is from a review of the month from 2011, so it's a bit dated, but not in any important way. Okay, so this is what JBF says about monopoly. He says, when we use the term monopoly, we do not use it in the very restrictive sense to refer to a market with a single seller. Monopoly in this sense is practically non-existent. Instead, we employ it as it has often been used in economics to refer to firms with sufficient market power to influence the price, output, and investment of an industry, thus exercising monopoly power and to limit new competitors entering the industry, even if there are high profits. These firms generally operate in oligopolistic markets where a handful of firms dominate production and can determine the price for the product. Okay, So there it is. We got corporations. That's like the main sort of unit that we're talking about here, but they have a particular type of power, and that power is called monopoly. Not in the game sense where you own all the properties, but in the sense where these corporations have a particular type of power, sufficient market power to like set the price and the output and like investments of entire industries, right? So it's monopoly, not in like the exact use of the word, but like in the approximate use of the word. It's like, an almost monopoly. Monopoly insofar as it really matters, right? It's like well, McDonald's and Burger King are two competing corporations, but I mean, they're not competing in the grand sense. They're both setting really similar prices for their products, right? And they're paying really similar prices for their labor. So, they have monopoly power over their like sector because they can influence the price directly. And I think that's the important piece here, right? So this is the type of corporation we're talking about here. Those that have the ability to set prices.
Right. And you could think of lots of other monopolies that affect your own life, like probably your internet bill or your cell phone bill or whatever. There's lots of different kinds of ways that all those prices, you might try to get a good deal here or there, but at the end of the day, they kind of even out depending on who you get. Or like, you could try to find like a smaller fledgling company that's kind of trying to undercut all the other big companies, but there's lots of ways that they too have challenges, and eventually, in some ways, the goal of a small company is to get bought up by a monopoly company anyway. That's like when you made it. So there's kind of lots of ways that most of us interact with these big monopolies one way or another. And again, monopoly is not the one single company. You can have a few companies, but the point is that they're all kind of in on the game. They're all setting the same terms for the market.
Yeah, totally. This is a dumb analogy or a dumb example, but I'm going to say it anyways. During the pandemic, when we couldn't go anywhere, I mean, it still is during the pandemic, but like in a different stage, I suppose. But anyways, my family, we ended up doing a lot of Postmates, and we would like order in food because it was like the only interesting thing in our life. But I remember like there was this period, I'm sure it still exists, honestly, but like on Postmates, there'd be all these like really weird names of restaurants popping up that I've never heard of in my entire life. Like, there'd be like some kind of like crazy taco restaurant. And then like I've never heard of it. And it's like, how could there be a new restaurant that I've never heard of? It's like, whatever, we're all locked down. And then I would look up the address, and it would actually just be like an IHOP or something. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, that's I think a great example though of the ways that corporations work, right? Like lots of brands, but fundamentally like one thing sort of behind it. Mm-hmm. Pretty fundamentally different though, I think, than like in the past.
Right. So let's talk maybe a little bit about how these function. So corporations are different from tycoons, robber barons in the 18th century. Like we said, instead of having, your rich boss who's building a mansion next to your mine with a big bank account running the show, Baran and Sweezy spend a lot of time talking about the ways that company men, as they call it, who are subsumed by the corporation itself, sort of run the show through boards of directors, investors, outside interest groups, and so on. And it's also very interesting because, like, they do almost like an economic psychology in this book of, like, the typical person in the 60s who worked for a corporation. And I think probably that, like, type figure is a little bit different now, especially in the age of, like, tech bros and all that kind of stuff, but not actually extremely different. It felt to me like a lot of what they're saying holds up. Anyway, here's something that they say that helps us parse it out a little bit more. The real capitalist today is not the individual businessman, but the corporation. What the businessman does in his private life, his attitude toward the getting and spending of his personal income, these are essentially irrelevant to the functioning of the system. What counts is what he does in the company life and his attitude toward the getting and spending of the company's income. And here there can be no doubt that the making and accumulating of profits hold as dominant a position today as they ever did. Over the portals of the magnificent office buildings of today, as on the wall of the modest counting house a century or two ago, it would be equally appropriate to find engraved the motto, "Accumulate, accumulate." That is Moses and the prophets, a classic line from Marx. But the key, right, is that, like, we've kind of, even though we still have this ideology that it's really businessmen or businesswomen or business they thems, I don't know, kind of out there trying to get theirs and do their thing and, you know, spend their investment and income and all that kind of stuff, enjoying their investment and growing it. The real key is these kind of weird collective operations of capital accumulation. And in fact, it's better for somebody to be a good functionary in that sort of system than it is for them to be like a rogue entrepreneur or something like that. And that's still true today, even though we still have these kind of celebrity capitalists like Elon Musk or, I don't know, like people on Shark Tank or something, these investment entrepreneurs. At the end of the day, it really comes down to these huge corporations where you have lots and lots and lots of people doing all kinds of analysis, trying to make the corporation make money. And that's the key, right? How do you kind of ironically build a collective privatization scheme, right? Like you're, despite all the story of individualism and capitalism, and there's lots of it, it's a huge collective effort to get all that exploited profit subsumed into one corporation. And that is a really fascinating sort of thing that they note, right? That this is a collective process of capitalists working together to build that kind of power.
That's right. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it's accumulate, like the line from Marx, but it's also like with the provision that it's accumulate so that you can even accumulate more tomorrow, right? It's like a particular type of accumulation where it's not just about like a breakneck, make as much money as you possibly can, but it's like, how can you create this whole scaffold so that you can make money from here till the end of time? Right. Yeah. Okay. So big corporations, they make money. And what makes them a monopoly is that they can set a price for something. And they have, kind of a command over the market. Something I found really interesting in this piece, we don't have to talk about it that much, but Baran and Sweezy talk about how, in a particular like market niche or whatever, corporations will kind of take turns being price leaders. One person can kind of like drop their price low and undercut everybody, but that means like the other people will end up following them and they'll kind of like do this in this like sort of cyclical way. But what's important is that like a corporation, they're not setting a price based on the, labor theory of value or something, or like how much XYZ or how much something costs. They're doing it because like they're trying to make a particular profit. And that's the part I think that people don't kind of recognize is that, the price that you're paying it's not grounded in reality. It's really aleatory. It's kind of floating. And it's just like something costs what it does because a corporation says it costs this much. And of course, they'll take into account all kinds of things like the rising cost of labor or like a scarcity of a particular thing. But still, I mean, like, what makes a corporation like a corporation in this particular sense is that they can set the price to be what they want it to be.
Yeah, it's really interesting, too, the way that they talk about it, because they say it doesn't really require a bunch of corporations getting in a room in a cartel sort of fashion to decide what the price is. Instead, it's because of that, what we were just talking about, that kind of desire to have this sustainable profit scheme that leads them to not undercut each other so quickly, because what they don't want to do is initiate a price war. So the idea is they call it tacit collusion, which is a really fun term. The idea is like, let's say there are a few different corporations and, they're all kind of in the same industry, like, I don't know, steel, let's say. That's like a example they choose. Or like the cigarette industry was a big 60s example that they use a lot of the time too. One of those big companies decides that it wants to undercut at the competitors. So all of a sudden they make their cigarettes cheaper. What Baran and Sweezy say is that is actually an extremely risky and potentially suicidal move, because if all the other corporations start kind of undercutting each other until people get to the barest slim profit margin they can get to, because of that monopoly power, because they're so huge, the chances are, one of them is going to be able to survive and everybody else is going to go under. And nobody really wants to do that, because the goal is really to sustainably continue to generate profit, which is way easier to do if everybody's kind of on the same page and not trying to outgun each other. And they even show some interesting examples of companies who will sometimes raise a price, and then if everybody else raises their prices too, they'll keep it. But if nobody else follows them, then they'll rescind the price raise and they'll go back down. So like I said, there's this kind of tacit collusion where all these monopolies are trying to avoid a price war, which is actually the opposite of what you'd expect if you thought that capitalism was this kind of cutthroat competition where everybody's fighting each other and then it benefits the consumer and everybody else in the end because you're always getting the cheapest price for the best product. On the contrary, there's a motivation among corporations to sort of keep a level of growth that's really sustainable. There's a kind of conservative or risk-averse logic built into being a corporation. And I think that is actually really helpful to understand. It's something I would never have thought about if I hadn't read this book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not a whole lot of competition in the capitalist economy right here. I think that's a pretty important piece to kind of like put in here. Okay, Dean, this is what I want you to talk about because I feel like you're probably better at than I am at this point. So in monopoly capital, right, all these corporations, they're not really competing. They're kind of like tacitly colluding with one another, like you said, to make a whole lot of money sustainably for the foreseeable future. So then what that means is that they have a lot of profits and the profits are increasing and they've got so much money. What are they going to do with all this like surplus profit?
All right. That's a great question. And they spend a lot of time talking about exactly that in the book. The majority of the book is really about what do capitalists do? What does the capitalist economy do with all the profit that they make? And in fact, having so much what they call surplus, which is profits, but lots of other stuff too, having so much of that is a huge problem, in fact. It creates all these other economic problems, and maybe we'll talk about that more in the next episode because it's kind of a huge topic. But they do come up with this really interesting kind of expansion of the Marxist story. So in the same way we were just saying that they build on the Marxist tradition to say, okay, maybe there was a time where there was this hyper-competitive capitalism in the 1800s for sure, and Marx figured it out. But now we've moved to this monopolistic stage where, instead we have this tacit collusion of big companies. Another change that makes to Marxism is a change in how we talk about sort of the rate of profits. And I'll just read what they have to say here, and then we'll talk about why this kind of jargony paragraph matters. So they say the whole motivation of cost reduction is to increase profits. And the monopolistic structure of markets enables the corporations to appropriate the lion's share of the fruits of increasing productivity directly in the form of higher profits. Don't worry, it's going to make sense in a minute. This means that under monopoly capitalism, declining costs imply continuously widening profit margins. And continuously widening profit margins in turn imply aggregate profits, which rise not only absolutely, but as a share of national product. We can formulate as a law of monopoly capitalism that the surplus tends to rise, both absolutely and relatively, as the system develops. So here's what they're trying to say. In capitalism, one thing that definitely didn't change is you always want to try to reduce your cost wherever you can, your production cost. If you think of yourself as a businessman, the example we always use on the show, for some reason, is you have a big shoe factory. Let's say you're a capitalist, you own a shoe factory. To get more money out of that factory, you have to figure out how to lower the costs going into what it takes to make a shoe so that when you sell it for the price you sell it at the market, there's a bigger profit, a bigger margin, a bigger gap between the cost you put into the shoe and the price, the money you're going to get for the shoe, right? That's kind of the basic economic piece. And there's lots of ways to cut costs. You can cut costs by having a more efficient shoe factory. You can cut costs by getting cheaper shoe materials. One of the biggest ways the capitalists cut cost is by screwing over workers because labor and people are also factored into production, right? Labor has a cost. So they want to reduce costs for labor by either making you work longer, reducing your wages, making you work less even, lots of different ways that they try to lower labor costs. So they're going on and on, Baran and Sweezy here, about lowering costs and how important that is. What they say is if you keep declining those costs, you're going to keep on raising those profit margins. And Baran and Sweezy say because it's a monopolistic structure where there's this kind of tacit collusion between all the big companies, reducing costs isn't really a like competitive warring structure anymore. You know, in the 1800s, you want to reduce your costs so you can put somebody else out of business. In monopoly capitalism, everybody's kind of doing the same thing. If you discover a way to make your shoes cheaper, then all the other shoe people are going to do the same thing, and their shoes will cost the same, and it'll all kind of pan out the same way. So the catch, though, for Baran and Sweezy is that means that profits are pretty much always going up. And that's a huge departure from Marxism in Marx's terms, in Marx's day, because Marx had kind of an opposite idea. That, in fact, because of competition, there would be a tendency of the rate of profit to fall because someone would outdo you, or you'd have a big problem in the production process and your profits would eventually kind of plateau and then go down. And so what Baran and Sweezy are saying is really a pretty radical thing in Marxist economics, which is, again, Marx got everything right, but capitalism has changed. And so that means that now there's this opposite tendency in our economy where the profit rate keeps on going up and up and up, and it doesn't tend to fall. And it keeps going up precisely because there's not that kind of cutthroat competition in capitalism anymore. So if this all sounds like, I don't know, boring or economic nerd talk or whatever, maybe one way of thinking about it is like, if you look up the sort of ratios between what a worker makes to what a boss makes, in like the last 100 years, it has increased by like 200% or something absolutely bonkers. So like if the rate of like, let's say you're like a person in a factory and what you make is like 1 to 24 compared to the boss. Like the boss makes 24 times more than an average worker. Like I think that was the case in like the 40s or 50s or something. Now it's like they make like, 260% more than the average worker, and the CEO is going to make even more exponentially than that, right? So it's widening that gap even not only between profits, but also the gap between what those profits get invested into. Guess what? They do not go back to workers. The value that keeps on going up does not come back to the people who create the value, the working people, without which there would be nothing to sell, nothing to profit off of. And that's a huge key to Baran and Sweezy's analysis, that that exploitation that Marx identified, that has not changed. And in fact, the rate of exploitation goes higher and higher and higher in monopoly capitalism.
If you want to see an example of that in practice, you can go to the AFL-CIO website, the big labor federation. They have a thing on their website. It's called Pay Watch, I think is what it's called. Yes. AFLCIO.org/paywatch, and you can go look up by corporation the like what they paid their CEO in 2021 and how much more that is than the average worker. So, like for example, Brian Nickel, who is the CEO of Chipotle, was paid 1,131 times more than the average worker in 2021, right? And in 2022, it's going to be more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, but it's cool. It's not cool. It's depressing, but you can track it, and that seems somehow important. But it's interesting. I mean, the AFL-CIO, their messaging around it is not like what Baran and Sweezy are saying. They're saying that like they're getting paid more because of greedy executives at the top, which is true in a certain sense. But like even if they weren't greedy, this would still happen.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if they're greedy or not. This is the way that capitalism works fundamentally. Let's see. There's so much more to say about this at all, but the surplus thing is really important. But like the monopoly characteristic is, I think, what makes this kind of set apart from the capitalist story that people have told in the past. And something else that's pretty important in it is the way that it actually weakens labor's power. So like, for example, whatever, you and your coworkers can organize, you can go on strike, and you can win higher wages, and that's really good for you, and you should definitely do that. Absolutely. But since corporations hold the power to like set prices, and like you were just saying, Dean, the rate of profit doesn't fall like you would think, or like Marx would think. There are like limits to how transformative just fighting for higher wages could be. So like workers can win higher wages through collective bargaining and going on strike and having a union and all that kind of stuff, and it's good and we love it for sure. but it's also unlikely that workers will actually ever see they won't actually see those profits on their check, because corporations will just like raise the prices to offset those rates they would give workers. And even if they didn't do that, it wouldn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like because the rate of profit doesn't fall, it doesn't really matter. Corporations could pay far more than they do, but they don't, as like more of a matter of principle than economics. I think that's really frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a huge point. And I think a good way to build appropriate kinds of class resentment, like at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like if you work for a big company, that company absolutely can pay you a lot more than you're being paid now, and they just choose not to. And the weird thing is, and something we'll talk about more maybe the next episode about absorption of surplus too, they don't even necessarily dump that capital back into the paychecks of CEOs. I mean, they dump tons of it into that, but they also dump it back into like advertising and kind of looking for ways to reinvest in the company in ways that may or may not, in fact, end up being productive. But the idea is like they're trying really hard just to do something with the surplus that they have because they have so much of it. Like the big point that Baran and Sweezy make is that there's so much surplus that the capitalist class literally does not know what to do with it. And they were saying this in the 1960s. Guess what? They have even more now, and they still don't know what to do with it. And that is so frustrating because, like, first of all, the people who work for them are not the people, like you said, Matt, getting the benefits of it, even though they could, and the company wouldn't miss it, wouldn't even notice. But also, like, we in capitalist societies live in places where people are homeless and going to bread lines and food kitchens and all that kind of stuff. And like they're obviously not investing in those kind of structures either. So we live in this situation where the surplus is always rising. Capitalists are always getting more money. Wealth is getting generated more and more and more. And it is just not rising all the boats along with that big tide of surplus, the way that capitalists like to pretend. Instead, more often than not, the capitalists are, getting better and better boats somewhere else, like somewhere that you can't be, and they're like forcing you to stay in the bay or whatever. I don't know how the metaphor works, but it's good to sort of recognize that at the end of the day, like they don't pay you because they don't want to.
Mm-hmm. Because to pay you what you're asking them would be like ceding power to people that aren't them, and they don't like that. I mean, you can see how it is like what appears as an economic problem is like actually extremely ideological as well.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to listen to workers because they don't want to listen to workers, like, and that's kind of it. It's not because it's going to put them out of business or whatever. It's because they just don't feel like it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is 47 minutes into this podcast right now, and I feel like we should have said this sooner, but they do make a distinction really early on that monopoly capital is talking about these these big global corporations rather than just like small businesses too. So, what we're saying here doesn't necessarily apply to all, to small businesses, which have their own sort of set of economic problems and things as well. But when it comes down to it, your boss can always pay you more. If they say they can't, they're probably lying.
Yeah. We'll see, too, how this all weakens labor power in a more collective way, maybe in the next episode. I feel like it's been good to parse out a lot of how monopoly capital works internal to corporations or, like, among big monopolies. But one of the most important parts of the books is that it talks about how there's there's a whole economy outside of the corporation as well. And all these decisions that are made in monopoly capitalist boardrooms and whatever, they have repercussions on national economies and global economies. And there are lots of ways that kind of bounces back to hurt working people, to hurt their buying power, to lower jobs, to create rising unemployment, is ways to respond to all kinds of problems that having too much money has. So we'll get into all that later on, but just to emphasize, like, they do this great analysis of kind of the internal behavior of corporations, and then they also talk about like the external ramifications or consequences of that behavior, which I think is a really exciting thing, but also very complicated, and that's why we're giving ourselves more time to understand it.
Yeah, totally. All right. There's actually one more piece of the puzzle here I want to add on. That this is kind of going outside the bounds of Baran Sweezy's book and Monopoly Capital itself. But I thought it was actually kind of important, and it does kind of help me answer a question I was curious about. Thinking earlier, Dean, about what you're saying. Why do you want to answer this question? Why is this important to you? This seemed important to me. So something that's kind of missing from this book is like a big conversation about labor, and that seems weird to me. I mean, it comes out in different ways, like we've talked about in this conversation already about wages and stuff. But it seems like there should be a bigger conversation about labor in this book, and this is maybe like a small piece of me trying to like figure that part of the of Monopoly Capital out. So I was doing a bit of research. John Bellamy Foster talks about this term, and a lot of other like labor economists do quite a bit as well. But there's monopoly on the one hand, right, which means the power to set prices and kind of affect a particular market. To be like a single seller in a sense, right? But there's also this other term called monopsony, which is the inverse, right? Instead of being a single seller, it means that you're like the single buyer of a particular good. And when people talk about monopsony, they're usually talking about like the labor market specifically, right? So it's not about like buying a particular like good, like unrefined or something. It's about buying labor, right? That your global corporation is the single buyer of labor. And I think that was that's been a helpful idea for me to kind of make some of this makes more sense in my brain, because I don't know, I don't want to overlook workers. So when people talk about like wages or like working conditions, especially when it comes to like low wage jobs, you might hear people on the right say something like, go find a different job, find a job that pays more, right? Is what they'll tell you. And not only will you hear this among people on the right, but you'll even hear this amongst low wage workers, right? People who work at McDonald's, but then they go get a job at Burger King because it pays $13 an hour rather than $12 an hour or something. And a monopsony, though, is a really important explanatory device here, because it's exactly why a worker can't just go find another job, or if they did find another job, it might not matter all that much. So like monopolies, a monopsony allows a handful of big corporations to set wages for like basically entire industries. So this is exactly why, whatever, you see a McDonald's on one corner that says now hiring $12 an hour, and you see a Wendy's across the street that says now hiring $13 an hour. For Wendy's or McDonald's, it doesn't really matter, right? The 12 or the 13, it doesn't matter to them. Who cares? Whatever. So industries, though, like with similar labor pools, they can set their wages basically wherever they want to, like whatever they think will work for their,
which is usually the legal minimum, right?
Right. Totally. It is definitely legal minimum in a lot of places. And, some places, though, have like a really, like, okay, for example, Texas, the minimum wage is $7.25 there. They don't have, their legal minimum is the federal legal minimum, which is awful. Though, like, you see how different like geographies, like they deal with that in different ways because of like rents and other things like that, right? If you want a pool of low wage workers in, I don't know, Houston, Texas, you probably have to pay more than $7.25 an hour because there's like an external factor weighing on it, right? So you might have to pay $13 or $14 or even $15 or $16, who knows? But again, it's not like the industry itself is like calculating how much that is, like, how much the labor is worth. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things to the industry itself, right? It matters to the workers. But anyways, this is important because you see how there's a monopoly not on just one end, but like on both ends, right? There's a monopoly in the way that corporations are facing consumers, but also in the way that it faces labor too. When it comes to this, you can kind of see it actually play out pretty, I don't know, obviously when it comes to like wage growth and productivity. So the Economic Policy Institute, which is like it's not a hard left institution in the sense that like, monthly review is or something. It's for liberals. They do all kinds of great economic data for labor unions and other types of organizations. And I mean, I think it's good. So whatever. The people that are running the Economic Policy Institute, I guess what I'm trying to say, are not like antagonistic to capitalism. They want a stronger welfare state, or they want higher wages, and that's great, but they're not like communists or something. So anyways, the Economic Policy Institute, though, they kind of talk about, they point to monopsony in terms of like the disparity between productivity and wages, and like how productivity has grown, but wages have not grown. They haven't caught up with productivity. So in a pretty recent thing from the Economic Policy Institute, they say that productivity and pay once climbed together. So there's a time when they kind of like, were in tandem. Productivity would go up and then wages would go up too. But in recent decades, they write, productivity and pay have diverged. Net productivity grew 59.7% from 1979 to 2019, while typical workers' compensation grew by 15.8%. So they go on to say this. If median hourly compensation had grown at the same rate over the 1979 to 2019 period, the median worker would be making $9 more per hour. So I think this is important because like it kind of shows you how illusory like wages actually are. They don't have anything to do with how productive a person actually is. It just has to do with how much a corporation wants to set their wages at. And I think that's kind of all there is to it, right? And it has to do with what a corporation wants to set their wages at, because that's the power that corporations have over the labor market. It's part of that monopoly, right? It's the other half of the monopoly puzzle. It's a monopoly on the consumer side, and it's a monopoly on the worker side.
And as we'll see too, Baran and Sweezy talk about how there's a huge problem when productivity grows and workers' compensation doesn't. It creates a big problem in the economy at large. It's a recipe for stagnation. People can't afford to buy the things that they're making, so there's too much stuff, too much productivity, too much surplus, and not enough ways to absorb that surplus in ways that kind of keep the economy moving. So it results in stagnation, inflation, all kinds of big problems. And in fact, lots of problems that we're dealing with as a result of the pandemic, although in some different ways. So we'll talk more about that in the next episode too. But I think it's helpful to recognize that like this is the result in part of ideology for sure, that capitalists recognize that they have control over the labor market, and it is a market that they can, set the prices for. But it also ends up kind of shooting them in the foot, because capitalism is an economic system prone to crisis and prone to self-destruction, and it's constantly kind of booming and busting all the time. So I think that's an important piece as well, that capitalists pursue these things in their own kind of short-term interests, right? Saving money by keeping the cost of labor low. But that move ends up really being a problem for all of us, and a good reason why we need to get rid of it, do something different.
For sure. Okay. So there you go, folks. This is the first installment of the Monopoly Capital series. You've heard it all here. You now have a better understanding of how capitalism works and how uncompetitive it is. I guess that's the theme of this episode, right? That capitalism is uncompetitive, and that's not exactly why it's bad, but it is definitely a big part of why it's bad. I mean, even if capitalism was competitive, I still wouldn't be a fan.
When it was very, very bad.
Sure. Right. Now just bad in a different way. But it's helpful to kind of get this stuff out on the table, though, because then you start to see the ways that I think that you start to see the power that corporations have, not only over consumers and markets, but also over workers. And I think that's bad.
You know what? I have to agree. So you've got the Baran and Sweezy take, and now you've got the Detlef and Bernico take. Their take took like 300 pages to make with lots of charts. Our take just takes a few minutes. It's simply, it's bad.
Well, I agree with both, but ours is to the point, and that's something. It's important. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can get an invite to our great, exclusive, cool, secret Discord chat. And it's fun, and we're having a great time over there. We just made a new channel just for the Catholics out there, to talk about their popes and their secret things.
The
whatever
Papist
Catholics
chat
are.
is real. We're talking about what day Epiphany really is today. It's really out there.
I need to make sure I mute that chat in particular because I don't need to know the secrets. I need to make sure I stay in the dark. No, don't let any of these secrets slip to me. That would be bad.
You're gonna have to make your own Episcopal chat, and it's gonna be the Walshingham channel.
Oh no. That's true. It'll be lots of conversations about how you can talk people into being in just one more church committee. That's what it'll all be about. Anyways, it's a fun community of people. I like that a lot. And you can also get access to our Behind the Paywall podcast that we've not recorded a new episode for in just a little bit, but we'll get there. Don't worry. In the new year, we're going to be on top of it. And it's fun too. Okay. Subscribe on Patreon, get all these great things, support some people like us. Not like, support us specifically. And that'd be great. We'd appreciate it. Okay. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Peace out.